Good evening. Welcome to tonight's special Shar School event, the launching of the memoir of former Virginia Governor, two-term United States Senator, and most proudly U.S. Marine Charles S. Chuck Robb. I am Mark Rozelle, and I serve as the Dean of the Shar School of Policy and Government here at George Mason University, and we are delighted to be a part of Governor Robb's book launch. This evening is even more special in that the moderator is Brian Lamb, founder, executive chairman, and former CEO of C-SPAN. No one is better suited to moderate a book talk than Brian Lamb, whose book notes program on C-SPAN spanned over 3 decades and had him interview literally thousands of authors. And by the way, there is a George Mason University connection here, as Brian Lamb donated to Mason's Rare Books Library his collection of books from his many interviews, including those with Presidents Nixon, Carter, Bush, Clinton, Bush II, and also Mikhail Gorbachev, Margaret Thatcher, among many, many others. He also, I appreciate, eagerly featured books by academic writers. And Governor Robb has held the position of visiting distinguished professor in what is now Mason's Shar School of Policy and Government. So we're very proud to have both of you here tonight for this book launch event. And I also know that there is an earlier professional connection between Brian Lamb and Governor Robb. So perhaps with that, I'll turn the program now over to Mr. Lamb, who can explain, and he will moderate tonight's program. Brian, thank you.
Mark, thank you very much. And good evening to everyone who is online tonight. Let me just start off, first of all, by talking about a man named Alan Merton. Mm-hmm. And Chuck Robb, you and I have a past with Alan Merton.
Absolutely.
It was a year ago, almost to the day, May 21st, when he died. And he was president of George Mason University for 17 years and did a tremendous job. What do you recall from Alan Merton? I know you were close to him.
Well, let me say, first of all, you and I and Alan, I think all met each other probably for the first time in that assignment over at the Whitehouse. I took home more probably from the White House meeting that we all joined up on at that particular moment. In any event, I'm delighted. And I believe Sally, Alan's wife, is with us tonight. And it would have been a really great opportunity to have a reunion if Alan were still with us, because we all got our notoriety start, I guess it was, in that assignment. And I was delighted. And incidentally, I should probably point out that Brian was the person at my request who escorted my mother-in-law down the grand staircase in the White House for our wedding. I got to select both the best man and the person who would escort my mother-in-law down the staircase. And Alan was the one who offered me a job at what was then the George Mason Public Policy School, and now the Shar School. And so that brings us together in a very well-defined atmosphere. So we know each other. We've had a lot of fun. As a matter of fact, I was interviewed one time by Brian on C-SPAN. I can't remember how long ago it was, but I remember. And that's one of the reasons that when I was given an opportunity to suggest various people, I said, if we can do this with Brian Lamb, that would be a great way to bring us all back together.
Chuck Robb, why did you write this book called In the Arena?
I wrote it because I recognized that I wasn't going to live forever. I thought I was indestructible for most of my life, but it wouldn't go on forever. And when the second of my parents, my father died first, they both lived into their 80s. When my mother died, the source of all the information about my heritage disappeared. I mean, anything that was in writing and was available, but I couldn't just call up my father when he was still alive or my mother when she was still alive and say, do you remember where I was at this particular point in my life? I had general recollection of things that we had done, but I didn't have necessarily a map point that I could point to, or individuals that I knew, or I thought I knew. And I could double check all those things. With both of those sources of information absent, Once I go, I go. I wanted to have something I could leave behind to answer some of those same questions from our children and grandchildren and their grandchildren. Up to that point, they'll wonder who this individual was that somebody says, were you related to so-and-so? And I didn't want them to have to hang their head and say, I don't know anything about the guy.
What was the hardest chapter or incident in this book for you to write?
Probably just getting started. I had been taking note. I started the whole process about 3 years before I left government. I hadn't done anything except make notes, knowing, and at that point, I had every intention of resigning after I had been reelected in 1994. That was the one I wanted to win. I was not all that thrilled with the legislative process, being perfectly honest. I'm much more of an executive than I am a legislator. And so the book was designed to give my descendants, starting with our own children, who were surprised when they read The Galley, that they said, Daddy, there's a lot of things we didn't know about you when you were a whole lot younger. And so it's a human effort to provide a long-term resource for children, grandchildren, and their issue.
I'm going to show you some video that you probably forgot about. The first time that you and I ever sat down for an interview was at the Pentagon. You were a captain in the Marine Corps. I was a lieutenant junior grade. And the reason we did this, and you might remember that I was, in fact, your first press secretary, according to the Washington Post, which they ran that story right around wedding time when I was answering some questions at the Pentagon about your background. But anyway, we sat down to do what was never aired as a practice interview. And
I thought you did air that one.
No, not that. That was
the one where you interspersed the statements from my father-in-law with statements that I'd made that were entirely unrelated.
Yeah,
everybody got a laugh because you created that.
We only used the video.
The first fake news.
I mean the audio, but I want you to see. It's only about a minute here. I just want you to see what you looked like in 1967 and about October. And I was trying to ask you tough questions that you would be faced with once you became the son-in-law of the President of the United States. Let's roll that, Billy, and see what it looks like. Don't seem to have the audio.
I was going to say, it looks like I'm shaking there. The camera, whoever was manning the camera at that point may have been a little shaky, but I'm not currently shaking. If I had that then, I'm over it. I'm trying to see what tie I had on then. I haven't bought any new ties in the last 10 or 15 years, and I recycle some. I don't think it's one I have on now.
Well, I'm not going to go ahead with the video because it appears that we're having trouble getting it started. So let's just go back to the book. In this book, I've got a lot of quotes from the book that you said, and one of the first things I want to ask you is why were you called in early life the little judge?
Well, it's because I had that sort of a personality, I guess. I would think about things and I would try to give serious answers at a very young age. I was way too full of myself, probably. But in any event, that one kind of stuck with me. And it came back and it was referenced way back. And somewhere along the line, we decided to put it back into the mix because it was some evidence of being a little perhaps too full of myself when I was very young.
These are just quotes from the book, and they're pulled out of context, so you can fill in the blanks. I see myself first and foremost as a Marine.
Absolutely. I was changed, and we can get to that permanently. The Marine Corps is permanently a part of my DNA. Lynda sometimes kids. She said, "You married the Marine Corps. I'm just your mistress." It clearly was a life. It wasn't so much altering. It wasn't that I was way out or whatever, but it very much was in keeping with my own sense of self and the sense of challenge and the sense of order and discipline that I like in life. All of the things that the Marines had done throughout our history and all of our services, but particularly the Marines, because I know you were in the Navy, and you haven't mentioned that yet, but in any event, you always got us to wherever we did the fighting, and we appreciated that. Okay, in any event, it was clear that was something that meant something to me. I sometimes refer to the Marine Corps as the world's largest fraternity. There are more permanent relationships between individuals who have worn the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor for part of their life, in some cases for all of their life. And there are very few that disengage completely. And it's just a very special something. You inherit a legacy that you want to try to live up to. And you have just like you and I are privileged. We're born white, straight, healthy, male, all of the other characters that we don't have to fight for those. Those just come by us. That's God's gift to us to get started. Almost everybody else who doesn't meet one of those particular criteria clearly has to come up a harder, stiffer ladder to make it to the point where they get accepted pretty quickly. You and I get accepted right away, or at least we get the benefit of the doubt going in. And until someone challenges our integrity or whatever, we probably don't fight back initially.
You also say in the book, and again, these are not in context. I just want you to tell us why you put it in the book. I would never be mistaken for a rocket scientist.
No, I do say in the book and talk about the fact that I had it way too easy going through grade school, junior high school, high school. I got way too good grades. And so I thought it was also always a piece of cake. And I got up I got an engineering scholarship to Cornell, and I had a good time. It's the first time I had been completely on my own. And there were a whole lot of college dreams to realize at that point. And I probably enjoyed more of them than I should have. I tried to get around to studying anytime I could, but I ended up losing a scholarship. I didn't fail anything. And so all of my credits transferred. But I realized that I had not had the kind of discipline in my educational upbringing that I needed. And that's one of the things that set me out to make sure that I didn't make that kind of mistake again. Things that were within my control, I wanted to do everything I could to max out. I talk about this a little bit in going to Quantico. It was very important to me.
What are the chances that you would have gotten in politics had you not married Lynda?
I can't really tell you for certain. I don't think that any of my siblings thought I was necessarily going to go into a political career. But I think that because when I went to Vietnam, I came back and I was head of the PLC program, which is the principal officer recruiting program for the Marine Corps. And I would go out and visit a lot of college campuses and make speeches. Frequently, I would be in my dress blues and ribbons and badges and medals and all that kind of thing. On my cover, I had the scrambled eggs, and everything that audiences thought they were prepared to hate. And I would take it. They were clearly there to get something off their shoulder. And to somehow condemn me. But by the time those speeches were over, they gave me a standing ovation. I thought, well, I'm able to communicate on a realistic basis. And that's what probably started me to think that if I can take on a hostile crowd and bring them around, I can take on some of the things that I thought were scars in Virginia's history. It had a whole lot going for it, but it had a terrible record with respect to the whole question of slavery and Jim Crow and whatever. And I thought there's a whole lot that can be done with what we have here to work with.
I want to make sure the audience knows that if they have questions that they can submit them, and we'll get to those in a few minutes. Here's another quote from your book. Vietnam changed me. How?
Well, it changed me in that it gave me a much better focus, and it incorporated values that I don't think I fully appreciated, that were deep inside. And so I found out for sure who I was. A lot of good things happened to me at Quantico, and a whole lot of good assignments that almost everybody would agree with, kind of favorite type assignments that everybody else would want. I wanted to go to Vietnam. You'll probably may get to that in due course. But it was important to me, certainly before my obligated service was over, to serve in that capacity, to see if I was as good as the Marine Corps seemed to think I was based on my performance up to that point.
In the book, you say, I have come to better understand the impact of the nationalist sentiment in Vietnam. The nationalist sentiment on the part of the Vietnamese.
Right. We let me say, I started off going over to do my job for my country. And I accepted initially almost completely the explanation that our government was then working with. And I think all of the people most responsible for the political decisions were made at that point were operating clearly in good faith. But it became obvious to me after I came back, particularly after I read I wanted to find out what this whole anti-war movement was really about. I was over there putting my life on the line for my country and my cause. And there are a whole lot of people that clearly don't agree with that. So I wanted to find out more about people who had a very different viewpoint than I did. And I read that book initially, and it gave me some insights. As I say in the book, it didn't cause me to suddenly tear up. I didn't have a draft card. I had a draft card before I went into the Marine Corps, but I went in on my own volition. What was the question? I tend to lose it. We're both over 80 now, so we don't have to make excuses for our age.
Well, the thing is, in the book, and I don't, you may have said this before you wrote the book, but this other quote was, you're talking about William Westmoreland, who was the commander of U.S. troops over there for 4 years. You said his strategy reflected a World War II mindset that didn't entirely take into account the motivations of the enemy or reflect the role of nationalism or patriotism in the fight for their country.
Yeah, let me just suggest that nationalism to me can be very dangerous if we think only our country can do this and only my own group can do this because other reasons that we just alluded to, and that isn't my. And I do talk about toward the end of the book about I'm a patriot first, and that's sometimes misused. But people that are really talking about nationalism, they want to be America first, America only. And I think we have a responsibility in the international world, all of the folks here on Earth. And going back to the question about Vietnam, I discovered over a period of time that Ho Chi Minh, for instance, that we all learned to hate going over there. We'd followed a lot of history and never really heard his point of view. But he seemed to understand that he could motivate his people by the comparison with what his people had experienced as a colonial entity under France. And after Dien Bien Phu, all that began to go away and crumble. And Ho Chi Minh and many of his, and General Giap and others were responsible for part of that. But it was clear to me that many of those, the people that fought for either the North Vietnamese Army, we call them the NVA, or the Viet Cong, which were aligned in terms of the objectives, but were not combined. The Viet Cong were, as you well know, were indigenous personnel that lived in the area and didn't wear uniforms. The NBA did. And so when we were directly engaged with the NBA, you knew who you were shooting at, whereas that was not true with the Viet Cong in many instances. But many of the NBA soldiers that we either killed in combat or took prisoners, we would take the papers, that's a standard intelligence gathering technique, and compare them and see, in many cases, while we're doing that, we would go through their clothing and we would find photos of spouses and children up in Hanoi or wherever they were at that particular moment, and realize that they're a whole lot like our folks. And one of the things I do point in there, talking about Lynda's father, is that he understood that there were real human beings fighting on both sides, notwithstanding their ideological differences, and that in many cases, they were fighting for what they thought was the preservation of their country, whereas we thought we were fighting to preserve the democracy at the request of the legitimate Vietnamese government, then referred to more as the South Vietnamese. But General Westmoreland, and I always got along personally with him very fine. He once brought me some cookies that Lynda had given him when he'd come in to brief her father. And we had nothing but a good personal relationship. But he was dealing mostly in body counts, and that to me was misleading. And so it isn't just how many of them you kill or how many of us get killed. It's a whole lot more important that what we're fighting for. And if we didn't perceive that they were fighting for what they believed was their freedom, and both sides believed that they were fighting for their both Vietnamese sides thought they were fighting for their freedom. We believed that if we didn't assist the South Vietnamese government or the legitimate Vietnamese government at the time, that the whole country and most of Southeast Asia would go communist. Fortunately, the war was ended, and we have become essentially allies with the population in Vietnam. And when I went back to Vietnam, when I was in the Senate, or when I was governor, I guess I didn't go to Vietnam while I was governor, but I did while in the Senate. Went back to Vietnam. You were always accepted pretty much at face value, whereas we wouldn't have been 20, 30 years ago, or however long it's been. It's just been, what, 40, 50 years since I've been in Vietnam, I guess. But they had developed respect for us. We developed respect for them, and we're able to dialogue. There are a couple of times where we clearly didn't have the dialogue quite perfected. I was taking some medicine for one of the parents and father of somebody from originally born in Vietnam, who'd come over to this country as a part of the whole migration that took place at that time, and knew that his father or a relative, I can't remember his father for sure, or maybe his uncle, but it was some relative, had a real need for medicine, and asked me if I would take it the next time I went to Vietnam. And I did, but I showed up at the airfield, and I was greeted by someone from the government and said, the meeting, you're not going to be able to deliver that. And it was very clear that that was a fixed decision that was been made for the government, by the government. But there was cooperation, and Bill Clinton in his foreword points out the fact that he particularly appreciated the fact, notwithstanding our differences in service in the military or in fighting in Vietnam, could talk to each other in ways that both of us could understand and realize that we're expressing our views in good faith. And that's one of the reasons that he and I hit it off so well early on.
For those that don't remember, Chuck Robb was Lieutenant Governor 78 to 82, Governor 82, 86, United States Senate 89 to 2001, and has been very active since then. We do have questions, and April Grayson at George Mason. I'm in Arlington, you're in McLean. and April Grayson has the questions on George Mason's campus. April, what do you have?
Okay, we have 4 questions right now. The first one is a comment, really. I am very interested in your political experiences with the Bird machine and the years leading up to and including your 1981 gubernatorial campaign.
Brian, if you got all of that, I'm not sure that I did. If you would restate the question, I don't want to.
I think the best thing is the questioner brought up the bird, the whole bird family in Virginia and the relationship to you and then leading up to your campaign, because you do write about it in the book.
Oh, yes, I do indeed. In fact, I would encourage anyone would like a little more detail on that whole question, because there was some dissent within our own political party on that question. But in any event, it was clearly not the kind of enlightened approach to the whole question of segregation that we presume to aspire to, having fought a battle for our own independence. And I wanted to change that and find ways to do it, but not necessarily create a new war within the states to do it, or within Virginia to do it, but wanted to bring Virginia around to rejecting the whole concept of Jim Crow, which was really an attempt to legitimize the slavery and the type of activity that was unsupportable that they had engaged in previously, and that many understood that was what the Civil War was all about. And in any event, it was clear to me that we had to change, because Harry Byrd Sr. had been very much a part of the segregationist approach to government, and was very restrictive on allowing anyone. He was then on the quote Democratic side, although his son eventually went independent and then basically caucused with the Republicans, I guess. We didn't serve at the same time in the Senate. But in any event, we had a black mark, if you will, against us in terms of our commitment to human rights, equal rights, all of the rights that we incorporate in a democracy. And I was very much on the other side of that issue. I wanted to see us get our record cleaned up. You can't really clean up the record, but make the kind of permanent changes. And I would say that I spent most of my time in office trying to make sure that the changes we made would become a permanent part of the way we governed in Virginia.
April, next question.
Okay, next one is from Eric Merton. What can current politicians do to explain the difference between nationalism versus patriotism?
Well, nationalism is a commitment to the causes. But patriotism is a commission to an idea. Nationalism, all too often, is simply an attempt to keep everybody else out for whatever reason, both in your international relations and certainly in the United States. Why those who had come from an ancestry that had been enslaved, or any of several other had been religiously persecuted, or other reasons, that they weren't somehow entitled to the same benefits that all of the rest of us had. And I wanted to make sure that we got that change. And so I was clearly in opposition to the kind of approach that Harry Byrd had developed. He was good on fiscal responsibility, but and I've been a fiscal responsibility hawk for most of my life. I had a real appreciation for fiscal responsibility when I was very young. I'll just digress for 1 second. My parents, they came from families that had been quite well off. The Depression wiped out their families, so they didn't have anything to pass down. And I knew that if I was going to go to college, I had to get a scholarship. I had to get a scholarship and work part-time while I was there. So fiscal responsibility is one of the things that I've always been front and center on. And I cover that in a little bit in the book, not in the in the full depth that I frequently do when I'm talking to folks. I think that it's a good thing to target our spending responsibly, but don't ignore the responsibility for paying for whatever we're going to put out to help correct whatever is wrong at this particular point.
By the way, Captain Robb, that question came from Sally and Alan Merton's son, Eric, in case you
Oh,
missed
good.
the name. Yeah.
Good for him. Good.
April, next question.
Okay, the next question is from Ann Holton. What are some of your favorite Lynda stories in the book or otherwise? Maybe some that show off her remarkable sense of humor?
Well, Anne, you know Lynda well. I know Lynda well. I know you well. I know your father and mother well, and I know your current husband well. We've all been pretty much in the same lane in terms of what our beliefs and what society ought to do. And I always found it easier than trying to worry about. I'd always try to understand the implications in terms of economic consequences of certain decisions that are made. But I would try to find out what I thought was really the right decision whenever I could. I think almost everybody says that, but not everybody necessarily is able to stick to that particular approach, particularly in the legislative process. There's a whole lot of trading off between individuals, sometimes to put a potential opponent or a current opponent at a disadvantage if they have to vote for certain proposals.
By the way,
I'm getting a cutoff sign from my wife in the background. Just you can't be seen right now.
But Ann Holton's question reminded me of a story, and I want you to tell from the book about
Okay.
the time, I believe you lived in Charlottesville, and the accident that Lynda had that was quite frightening that you tell us. Can you tell that story? The one with when she went down the hill?
Yes. When I was back from Vietnam at this point, we were down in Charlottesville. I had, in fact, Lynda sometimes accused me of having decided to go to law school, having decided to go to University of Virginia before I ever even told her all about it. That's not true, but it's sometimes it feels that way, I guess, if I seem to be steering my own course. And she has always gotten in step with whatever I was pursuing at the time. And I credit whatever success that I've had in life in very large part by the support and encouragement that I've had from Lynda. She didn't want to marry a politician in the first place. She wasn't anxious for me to get out and go to law. She would have been happy, I think, if I had stayed on active duty in the Marine Corps. I had never intended to be career military, but I decided to go back to law school. And at that point, our lives changed. She's given me this signal to shorten my answers a little bit. Okay. I can still take coaching, particularly from someone I admire, respect, and love.
April, next question.
Okay, this is from Larry Pfeiffer, director of the Michael Hayden Center for Intelligence here at the Schar School. He says hello on behalf of General Hayden. Question, given the time you spent on the Senate Intelligence Committee and as co-chair of the Iraq Intelligence Commission, what advice would you give today's overseers of intelligence activity?
First of all, I was very pleased to be a member of the intelligence community for that period. I wasn't formally a member of the community per se. I had both a legislative role, and then after leaving government, President Bush very kindly asked me to come in and co-chair a commission with Larry Silberman, a federal appellate judge, who was on the our side of the aisle, and we became close friends. But now I've forgotten the question. That happens.
Talking about intelligence.
Oh yes, but I mean we delved deeply into the what happened, and our mandate, in the eyes of some folks, was just to hang those who made the decision to attack Iraq at that particular point. Larry Silberman and I agreed early on, and both President George W. Bush, he promised me face to face, he said, I will not interfere politically. And I took him at his word, and he was good to it. He was true to his word. he didn't attempt to interfere and allowed us to have all of the, now everybody knows what the PDB is, President's Daily Brief, which is the daily briefing that the intelligence community gives to the commander-in-chief. In any event, I developed an even greater respect for members of the community because theirs was not always an easy job. They couldn't tell their own family about many of the things that they were doing. It's not that there were anything that was illegal. It's just that they were so sensitive. You didn't want to give any particular advantage to those who don't have our best interest at heart.
Next question, April.
Okay, this is from Bill Schneider. When I was growing up in Virginia, it was the most Republican Southern state. Now it's the most Democratic Southern state. Do you think you had a role in making that happen?
I hope I did. I mean, yes, the answer is to your question is yes. I think if there's any accomplishment that I think I may be able to take to my grave, it's that I worked hard. A couple of things. One was on a party situation. I made it respectable for a Democrat in Virginia to show that we could, that we cared enough, that we what's the word I used to use, a phrase I use at the convention in 1984 out in San Francisco. What's the, okay, I'm getting shaking heads from both Alice and my wife at this point. Causing enough to care, and that's not the word I'm looking for. Somehow I'm doing a senior moment. And at the same time, tough enough to govern. And that's why there's a responsibility to make difficult decisions that are not always politically popular. And that I particularly enjoy doing that because from both the history that we had with respect to segregation and the human rights question and everything that is encompassed in that concern, but because I was a commissioned Marine officer and because I had led a company in combat in Vietnam, I was given the benefit of the doubt, whereas many on the national scene seemed to be lining up in the so-called anti-war movement. And at that point, no one was giving Democrats much of an opportunity to make their case in Virginia. And it was clearly a very Republican state for a long period of time and remains largely a Republican state, but much more open to individuals and points of view that are not necessarily part of that particular agenda or that ideology, I guess.
What you got, April?
No more questions at this point. Do you want Billy to try your video again?
Well, I don't want to interrupt the flow of the conversation.
Let me just say, because the last question, was that the one for Man Holton, or no, it was before that?
No.
But I think that I want to praise Lynda Holton. He made some very difficult decisions politically at a very important time in our Virginia history, when he put his daughters, including Anne, into public schools, which was not a popular thing to do at that point. And I say in my book, no one deserves more praise for bringing Virginia forward in terms of public support for public education than Lynda Holton. Who was a different party for viewers who may not know.
You spend some time in your book, I'd say quite a bit of time, talking about Doug Wilder. Yeah. What was your approach to this whole story from the beginning of your friendship when he was a state senator till you went through that whole possible indictment that did not happen?
Well, first of all, Doug and I were friends, are friends. We had our styles are a little different. Our priorities may be a little different. And I do talk about this in the book. He used, when I was governor, he sometimes came up to my office on the third floor of the Capitol. At that time, it's not there anymore. They moved it over to another building. But he would come up and we would talk. And it was clear that he was interested in running for statewide office at some point. And he acknowledged to me, said, I think with what you've done, you've made it possible for me to run at this point. And I appreciated that a great deal. There was a lot made of our, quote, feud, but in every public appearance where we were both present, since that became an issue, he has made an extra effort to credit me with a lot of things that he felt were in the long-term interest of Virginia and made it possible for a much more diverse group of individuals in the Commonwealth of Virginia to take leadership positions, including running for statewide office.
Let me go to the end of the story about when you were not indicted over the whole idea that you had been involved in capturing some of the phone conversations of Doug Wilder. This is the quote I want you to deal with. You say, "I never completely recovered the kind of drive, energy, or momentum that had marked my earlier career." Explain that.
Well, to a certain extent, I mean, my integrity had always been my most important absolute, beyond my devotion to my wife and all kinds of other things. But I mean, in terms of other characteristics, and to the extent that there were stories that were circulated and certainly passed on by those who didn't have my best interest at heart, that were contrary to what I believed and had said or done, whatever the case may be, I just always thought that those would be revealed in due course to be false, without substance. And they never did have anything to back them up. I thought simply denying those stories at the time would put that to rest.
How close did you come to ever running for president?
I didn't. I made my peace with that a long time ago. I know that there were many that somehow either thought I must have that in my long-term aspirations or whatever, or thought that I could or should, whatever. I've always appreciated that. But I try to explain in the book that I didn't think that I could say the kinds of things that I would have to say to get the Democratic nomination for president. I had to bring on, particularly during the course of the time that I was governor and in Virginia and in national politics generally, bring people over to the side of those of us who believe that we ought to have a more broadly based party. Again, and one of the reasons I didn't accept a position in the George W. Bush administration, Dick Cheney gave me a call in Charlottesville, I guess it was, anyhow, after that election was over, and said, "You know, we've made a commitment to put at least one Democrat in the cabinet." And it couldn't have been nicer. And I said, I don't think, I very much appreciate the invitation. I don't think that it would work all that successfully at this point. I'm too identified with issues that would give many of your principal supporters a bit of an indigestion. And if I were to adopt your position in order to be in your cabinet, I would give my supporters indigestion. And I didn't want people to think that I didn't have a core. And in any event, it would have been a very difficult quest on my part. I recognize that I had the benefit of seeing, being a part of Lynda's family and seeing how much it took out of her father, particularly during the Vietnam War. I mean, he cared deeply, and it wasn't always evident. And most of the folks who were out commanding or out shouting, particularly around the White House. Lynda had a room in the White House which heard all the shouts from the square right across the house, and she heard, "LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" That's at some point, if you're leading a country and think that you have all of these good things that you want to do for your country, that takes a lot out of you. And he never wilted from that entirely, but it clearly took a lot out of him. And believing that I didn't have the full support at that point of enough of the special, I don't like to use the word special, individual interest groups that would react unfavorably. And I would have to say things that I knew I couldn't say to earn their support. I did point out that I thought that was one of the difficulties that Fritz Mondale had when he ran for president. He had made so many commitments to so many individual interest groups that he appeared to be, in the eyes of way too many people to get elected, to be beholden to each of those interest groups individually. And I was never bashing any of the interest groups. In fact, when we formed the Democratic Leadership Council, it was designed to try to bring everybody together. And there was some consternation initially when we started gearing up. I got a letter after the speech that I gave in San Francisco in the 1984 campaign from Sam Nunn. He said, there's a whole lot of folks in the Senate that I know and talk to that think just like you do. And I wasn't looking to start a national movement at that point, but it made sense. It resonated with me. And so we did meet. What was the question? Where I've already lost the question, the line. I apologize.
No, you're doing fine. We're going to April has another question, I think.
Okay.
Okay, we have another one from Larry Pfeiffer. Terry McAuliffe is running for another term as Virginia governor, non-consecutive as the state constitution requires. Should Virginia amend its constitution to allow a governor more than one consecutive term?
I never supported that approach. I thought that the system that we had required any individual who's privileged to serve in that high office. You've got 4 years to get everything accomplished that you want to accomplish. And then if you're successful, there's a very good chance that whoever you support to succeed you is going to carry on with those your same general priorities for government. Mills Godwin is the only person that did it. He did it first time as a Democrat, and then he did it as a Republican the second time. I think most people would agree, not everybody by any means, but most people would agree that his most successful term was his first term.
So of all the jobs you've had, excluding the Marine Corps, what, just from a personal feeling of accomplishment, which one was your favorite?
Well, there's no question, and I respond to this question the same way every time. I enjoyed being governor a great deal more than I enjoyed being a legislator. You have an opportunity to craft a solution for the whole entity. You get the final vote, so to speak, and you have a responsibility for which you should be held responsible if you don't carry out what you've suggested are going to do. But the role of governor gives you that singular responsibility. That's what I liked about the Marine Corps. There is an understanding of a chain of command, if you will. We have it in government. We have it in the services. We have it in most businesses and in many other organizations. Somebody is at the head of that organization for a period of time. Shouldn't be for life. There's an interesting concern now about the Supreme Court. And I'm intrigued by the possibility that we might eliminate the lifetime tenure rather than anything that might be viewed as court packing. I didn't want to really get into any other issues right now. But one of the reasons, and I ever since I was elected governor, I felt that the people who are the political folks that really work hard don't themselves, in most cases, have a chance to have that kind of recognition and opportunity to carry out a program. They ought to have an opportunity in selecting the nominee that they think would most represent their views. So I would stay out of, and I've gotten in trouble, not trouble, but I mean, I've disappointed allies who've run for various offices who had supported me. And I said, I've told everybody else, I promised, I break my word to everybody else. I've told I'm not going to endorse anybody in this contest. So I have stayed out of, I haven't endorsed anyone in a party nominated contest in Virginia since my election as governor. But I've always been foursquare behind the party nominee, more enthusiastically in some cases than others, but always loyal. And I never enjoyed having to disagree with party leadership. But the party leaders, and I talk about this some in the book, there are sometimes when they have to take positions or they take positions in support of what they believe to be the interest of most of their members and have to carry those out. One of the reasons I did accept the position as chairman of the Democratic Senate Campaign Committee was because it was not an ideological committee. It was simply trying to find and recruit candidates. I'd done that in recruiting Marine officers. I knew that it involves a lot of speeches and fundraising, and I could do that in good conscience without being forced, in effect, to support positions that I did not agree with philosophically. That gave me more independent opportunity to exercise my judgment, and I've always liked that.
April, you have a question?
Yes, from Eric Merton. Were you ever on a short list for vice president?
Well, I sort of, I really would prefer not to answer that question. I don't want to embarrass anybody at this point. I was urged at one point by someone to form a ticket early, and I will not go beyond that. I'm not even going to tell you party affiliation at this point.
You talk in the back of the book about how you went about writing this book, and you suggest that you read Kay Graham's book and also Ben Bradley's book, and they had an impact on you. What was the impact?
No question. I thought that because I knew both individuals. I knew Ben and I knew Kay, and I knew enough about them to know what they were, what motivated them to do a lot of things in life. And I thought that their biographical, or I guess they were both listed as memoirs, but in any event, I like the way that it was handled. I like the writing. I like the way Kay was able to, and this is one advantage where I think women have a little more leeway in showing feelings. I was brought up, men don't cry. I mean, that's foolishness. I have tears in my mind, and my eyes will gleam up when I get really happy about something one of our children or grandchildren have done. And I'll be disappointed if there's a story that is a sad story or whatever the case may be. But I like the opportunity to craft plans to deal with needs within whatever body you're referring to, and then the responsibility for carrying it out, and the need to develop friendships with the legislative people to get enough people to carry out your plan. I was fortunate when I was governor to have a Democratic majority. It was a very thin majority, a relatively thin majority in both houses. But I was reminded, and I think I put this in the book, I've kind of forgotten right now, but I was approached by some very conservative past segregationist Democrats at one point, say, we can always be Republicans. And I knew exactly what they were telling me. And there's some other cute little stories in there, particularly about one of my cabinet secretaries that I hope people will enjoy.
Question was emailed earlier in the day from Mike Murphy, and he says, "Sir, during your session with LBJ Library, you referenced our treatment and or abandonment of local national interpreters in Vietnam. Do you know of any concerted U.S. government efforts to secure passage to the U.S. for our Iraqi or Afghan interpreters?"
There have been efforts. They haven't yet succeeded. I think it is unconscionable to depend on interpreters in many cases, and that's true in most cases, who incur the wrath of their own people to help us, and then we walk away and we come back to families, loved ones, and they're left to deal with their fellow citizens as you were one who was responsible for helping the enemy, if you will, and leave them to their own. I mean, if there anybody that had an argument for coming to this country, not clear citizenship right off the bat, but for being able to come and visit, it's somebody in that situation. That's the best argument for migration today. If you have something, if you're subjected to potential dangers from your own people, if you will, your fellow citizens in your own country, that's the most credible argument, not just to come here to get a better job or whatever the case may be. Those are all good arguments, but the very best argument to me that we ought to be go out of our way to try to help those who helped us. It really has only a little to do with the military or governance. It's a basic principle that I mean, if you can do that, it isn't just you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. I do not subscribe to that in any ultimate sense at all. I mean, it has to be for good causes, not things that all too often will be less than a good cause that will involve some financial interest or whatever the case may be. No, I mean, you can go back to the basic principles, which you learn at your parents' knee. In most cases, your mother's knee was the most influential in the early years. The same values that you developed then, if you can look in the mirror and see those manifest in what you're doing, what you have said, what you have made your own priorities, you're going to sleep pretty well at night. Now, I'm not sleeping well at night right now because it has nothing to do with the pandemic. I mean, it's not the pandemic. I've got other problems I have to deal with, but I don't sleep because I have any kind of qualms of conscience. And there are some of the votes that I took that got the most notoriety, where I acknowledged that it was politically not helpful at all, but I felt best because I was really earning my keep by standing up to either support causes that I believed in, which were not supported politically, or in more cases, to oppose popular causes that normally generated a lot of vocal and financial support for candidates or political support, when I thought that they were simply wrong. And that I won't go into a long detail right now, but the so-called flag burning is just one example of this. I clearly was a big supporter of our flag. I have handed it to too many widows at funerals or in other services not to have enormous respect for our flag. But when it came down to what's the best way to protect our flag, making a law that said it was illegal to say anything that appeared to be contrary to pure patriotism. I mean, we were founded as a country because we didn't want to be part of a monarchy. Anyway, that's been at the core of what helps me resolve any tough questions. But the point I was making, I guess, is that the choices I made then gave me more satisfaction than almost any other votes that I cast, because I knew that I was out on thin ice politically, but I thought I was doing the right thing. I could live with my conscience.
Want to thank April Grayson for doing such a good job on the questions. And Chuck Robb, we are out of time. Do you have a final comment you want to make?
No, just thank you for coming back. I've not only we've been friends for a long time, but I've followed you for a career. And I almost, when I was in the Senate, I would almost always have my television tuned to either C-SPAN or C-SPAN 2. C-SPAN 2 more often, because that's what the Senate was, until you could watch speeches and not have to go over there. But I always liked the fact that you did I thought a first-rate job in terms of trying to get at the truth and not just giving softballs to anybody that might come along. I mean, I appreciate softballs, but that doesn't really get me going.
The name of the book.
It looks like Mark is ready to come back on. Yes. Okay. Thank you.
In the Arena is the book, and it's in the bookstores. And thank you, Chuck Robb. Mark, do you have a final comment?
I just want to say thank you. It was a wonderful program, and we really appreciate Governor Robb. You did your book launch here at the Schar School of Policy and Government, George Mason University. Great to see you again, Brian Lamb. So thank you to everyone who attended this evening's event. And let me say thank you and good night to Naval Man Brian Lamb and Marine Chuck Robb. Correct?
Thank you.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Okay. Should